My name is Theresa Matson Coughlan. My name sign is a T on the side of my cheek. And I come from Oregon. I live in the Portland metropolitan area, right near downtown. Now, what first captivated me about quilting is an interesting story. As I grew up, I always played at my mother's feet as she sewed her own clothes. I loved to play with all the different fabrics. I was fascinated with the colors and the patterns and the textures of the different cloth. I used to play around her all the time as she was working. She had this one chest in which she kept all of her different fabric scraps. More and more colors and patterns were inside, and I used to abscond with a few of the pieces and squirrel them away in my room. When I got a little bit older, I asked my mother if she would please teach me how to sew by hand, and so she did. It was wonderful. I loved cutting out the pieces of fabric and sewing them together. But I did become frustrated because I wasn't as adept at it as my mother, who was such an accomplished seamstress. When I was 9 years old, for Christmas, my mother gave me a toy sewing machine. Just a little model that I operated by hand. I was so excited. But it wasn't a very good quality machine, and I asked my mother if she'd give me more fabrics and other things to work with, and she said no, I just have to make do with what I had. When I was a senior in high school, for a graduation gift, my mother gave me my first real bona fide sewing machine. I was so excited, and I began to make my own clothes. That seemed to content me for a while. It never even occurred to me to try quilting. Later on, I decided to try knitting. I learned how to knit, and I created my own sweaters, my own designs. I didn't follow any other template from magazines or any other source. I just came up with my own designs. I did all the measuring on my own for arms and collars. I figured that that was pretty much going to be my career path in the future. Then I entered RIT. I was in the weaving and textiles major at the time. They had that housed over in Building 7. I had 2 teachers, Mr. B and Max Lenderman. Both of them were my teachers. They saw my knitting, and they were impressed with how beautiful these sweaters were. They said that I should learn how to dye and make my own yarn and make my own fabric, which I did. And they noticed that it was so easy for me. I would pick up anything that I tried to learn right away and become good at it. Max wanted to challenge me. So he said, "Hey, why don't you start quilting? You could do a quilt for your master's thesis." I wasn't very enthusiastic about the idea. And he said, "Come on, why not?" He really pushed me. So reluctantly, I agreed. I decided to try to make a quilt. And Max said, "You should specifically try to come up with your own personal trademark, your own style, not derived from anybody else's ideas other than your own. You have to figure it out yourself." So again, reluctantly, I took on this challenge. My first quilt represented the 4 seasons: fall, winter, spring, and summer. They were all basically the same pattern, but they used different colors appropriate to each season. Well, it turned out great. It was so cool. The one panel that represented winter actually got into an international juried show. It was a quilting show, and it was in honor of Susan B. Anthony. This show took place here on the RIT campus. It was a few years ago. I can't remember the exact year it took place. I believe it was 1994, somewhere around there. So my first quilt got into this official show. There it was hanging on the wall, and it really inspired me to keep going. Now, a few years later, I was doing some quilting here and there, but I hadn't yet found what Max was calling my own personal trademark or stamp. And then in 1999, I had this dream. And the dream said to me, "Make an ASL quilt." I thought that was a great idea, a quilt that would incorporate ASL. But I was scared to try this because it would be so hard to represent hands and facial expression. This was something I had no previous experience with. I was too scared, and I let my fear control my life for a while in that regard. 5 years later, I wondered, what is holding me back with this project? It's something that's gnawing at me. It's as if this dream was trying to get my attention. Please give it a try. So I did decide to try. Rolled up my sleeves and decided to undertake it. It was such a struggle. I really worked hard at it, especially with the hands, and also using different planes of representation in the space of the quilt. But I got better at it with more and more time and more practice. It got easier, and then I couldn't believe that I hadn't started this a long time ago. I should never have let fear run my life that way. It was such a mistake. And if I had one message to give to new artists, I would say, please don't follow in my footsteps. Please, just do what you want to do. You have to try things out yourself. You give it a try first, and if you fail, that's okay. Because that's the way we learn. That's the learning process. So the next project and the subsequent projects became easier and easier for me. My first showing in an art gallery was here at NTID, and people were so excited. I had such great feedback from them. And that's when I decided that I would continue with, now was becoming my trademark, of showing the deaf experience portrayed in the quilting medium. When I began working on my first quilt, I did ask somebody to sign for me, to sort of serve as a model. And I took a lot of pictures of them so I could study their hand movements and facial expressions. I said, tell me a story, any story at all that comes to mind. And that was a very challenging process for me. I wanted them to tell me any story. They said, which? And I said, it doesn't matter, anything you want. That's going to be the challenge for me. I don't want to make this too easy on myself. So my sign model came up with a story, which they performed for me. I got the facial movement, the expression, everything. Took a lot of pictures, and this poor person had to put up with the flashing of the camera in their faces the whole time. Then I laid the photos in front of me, and I picked out the ones that I felt would contribute most to the flow of the story. Because the quilt had to tell a story, and I'd pick out which ones that would be the best components. This was a deaf person who told the story, so I knew everything would be signed the right way. And then I had to think about how to represent sort of a three-dimensionality to the quilt. Something I learned from the art program was the fact that you could have different planes represented in the quilt. This was the training I'd received in the art program here at RIT, so I was carrying those techniques with me as I was planning how to go about doing this. Now, I'm really not very good at color theory. Mr. B had told me I really needed to take a color theory class and study how it all worked together. I wasn't familiar with the color wheel at all at that time, which is kind of funny when you think about how I grew up with all the art around me. I played so much with fabrics and colors. My mother had all these colorful pieces all around all the time. But I had never really thought about how colors relate to each other, how they influence and impact upon each other. So I became more and more cognizant of how that all came together. So I also realized that the aesthetic is that you need to see something and appreciate it, and at the same time have it all work together in terms of the theory. My quilt piece I put together by just throwing different scraps of fabric together. In the beginning, I didn't even have a form or purpose to it. I just put it together to represent people of all different colors. And that was the goal of it overall, was not necessarily to have them work together, but to show the differences amongst all people. And it also to show that peace comes in all forms and all languages. The way I began making this quilt was by creating these strips that radiated from the center. I wanted to incorporate the theme of love. That was going to be the overriding message of the quilt. And I knew I wanted to make it a round quilt, a circular one, to represent the universe, the world, the globe. Love is everywhere. Love is all around us. And so I thought I would try to challenge myself by making a round quilt. It's the first time I had ever attempted that. And I started by coming up with these long panels. Where would I put the message of love within them was my big question. Then I came up with the idea of alternating L-O-V-E, the letters, and at the end having hearts and flowers. In the center of the quilt is the sun, because the sun is warm, and love is radiant, and it flows from the center of all things. I wanted to also emphasize the idea of diversity. So every letter in L-O-V-E is a different color, going from light to darker skin, because love knows no boundaries of color or race or creed. Love is all over the world, and it's available to everybody. Well, people often comment when they see this, "Oh man, you did all 3 layers of this huge round quilt at the same time, sewed them all the way through on a sewing machine? You have the top layer, the middle layer, which is the batting, and the last layer, which is the back or the lining." And they imagine that I was sewing all 3 layers at the same time on my little sewing machine. I always have to tell them no. The secret is that I created each of these panels separately and sewed all 3 layers for each of the 24 panels separately. It was much more easy to do on a smaller scale, and I could handle it better on my sewing machine. When all 24 panels were done, I put them all together in this round shape. And then, as I put them together, I was able to do the overstitching on the whole quilt so that it all hung together. It was a lot easier on me that way. Also kept me from going completely crazy. Well, if you notice in the center here, that part I had underneath the needle of my sewing machine, and I had to rotate it very carefully as I was sewing these spiral stitches to the outskirts of the globe that's in the middle. And then I did the same thing in concentric circles, the edges of each letter being the boundary of where I would do the circles of overstitching. It was a lot easier to do it that way. Now, as for the binding on the edges, I did machine sew those, and then I folded it over and did hand stitch finish to complete the hem. This is a 500-piece pattern quilt. This is entitled ASL Oppression. The sign for oppression doesn't seem to be very standard at this time. It's not widely accepted. Some areas don't really utilize that sign. But the point is, why is sign language so oppressed? It's a beautiful means of communication. It's a bona fide language in its own right. It incorporates emotions and expression. And it's so inspiring to people. Why is ASL always under siege? You can see from this shape that it's being oppressed. People often think that language is only based on sound and vocalization. Well, I looked up in the dictionary, and I saw that in the definition, although voice and sound are parts of the definition, it also said marked gestures. Marked gestures. That means communicating with your hands, which is what ASL is too. I put in the quilt these representations of people of different colors because I wanted to represent different races. You may notice that these figures have no forearms. They've been chopped off. And that's to show that they were not allowed to sign. And in a sense, that makes them dead because it's so restrictive. That's why I made the faces look like skulls. It's not really fair for the people who really want to be able to communicate using sign language to not be able to do so. It's akin to hearing people not being allowed to talk and use their voices. Without that, there's no communication. And the same goes for deaf people with sign language. Now, the color red represents anger, very powerful emotion. The colors in this quadrant represent fall and the death that autumn brings. Oppression causes death, and we don't want that to happen. We want to encourage more signing and the perpetuation of this beautiful language. We don't want to allow ASL to have further oppression and possibly dissipate altogether. I have a story about this quilt. Now, before this one, I had always focused on other people's experiences and put their stories into quilt form, deaf and hearing, whatever. And then I realized, what about me? Here I am, this deaf person, and I haven't told my story that way. I grew up a non-signer. I didn't learn sign language till I was 25. I was a lip reader and a speech reader. I had so many frustrating experiences trying to speech read as I grew up, and I realized that there was the theme for my quilt. This is what my experience was like, trying to lip read all the different shapes and configurations of mouths that people have, men with mustaches that cover up their upper lip, preventing me from being able to lip read. One day I was walking on the street in Portland, Oregon, and a beggar tried to get my attention. His teeth were all weird, and gestured to him that I couldn't hear him, that my ears were broken. His teeth were cracked and horrible, and I couldn't understand him. I had a friend who had gotten braces, and I hadn't seen her in a very long time, and then she shows up with these silver wires on her teeth. I had to try to lip read her all over again because I couldn't. Another interesting fact is that I'm not used to Black people's speech. Now, I don't mean to be insulting at all, but I was trained to lip read by a white speech teacher. And so I have no template to learn how to speech read Black people. And again, I don't want to be offensive in my comments, but it's just something that's not in my experience. So all these frustrations over the years had such an impact on me. It's such a challenge to lip read people. And so I presented it here in this quilt. This quilt is metamorphosis, that evolution of a caterpillar to butterfly. When my son was 5 years old, he came rushing home one day, and he said, Mom, guess what? Guess what? I saw, and he signed, a caterpillar growing, coming out of a cocoon, becoming a butterfly. It was so adorable. He was only 5 years old, and there he was signing this to me. I said, oh, would you tell me this story again for me, please, while I take some pictures of you? I thought it'd be really great to have a child's story in a quilt form. So my son was surprised, but he went ahead and signed the whole thing over again for me while I took a series of pictures of him. I put them together, and I had to make sure I was very careful about what came first and second and finally, so I could show the progression of the story as a caterpillar moves to the chrysalis and then to a butterfly. My son is hearing. He was only 5. And he signed caterpillar, but it's interesting, that wasn't a sign that I had ever taught him. He came up with that himself. This is entitled Vocalization. You see the V displayed in the front there. I've heard so many stories from the deaf people and hearing people. I know this hearing person who had a completely deaf family. Parents were deaf, siblings, aunts, uncles, grandparents, everybody down the line. A multi-generational deaf family with one hearing person born into it. And he told me his story, which so surprised me. He's the only hearing person in this family, and so sign language was his first language. Finally, it was time to go to school. And the first day he entered the classroom, and the teacher was absolutely aghast. No, put your hands down, she said. You must talk. But he didn't know how to talk. He tried to use his voice, but he just signed instead. He really didn't know how to talk, and so the teacher bound his hands and put them in back of him. This is a hearing person with a parallel experience to the deaf community. It really hit me. Now, this person did grow up eventually to become an interpreter. It was so powerful. What an impact it had. So this kind of oppression isn't limited just to deaf people. Hearing people can experience it too, especially CODAs, children of deaf adults. I felt that the message that that community gets as well as the deaf community gets is very similar. And so I had that represented in this quilt. On this side, you have the talking mouths. Come on, use your voice. Come on, speak, speak. And all the overlapping messages that we get over here written down. The question marks show that we don't really understand what's going on. Now, the reason I have this sort of bar separating these sides is because one side focuses on the hands and the other is more the sounds, the messages that we get that people are speaking to us. Sign language is a silent language, so I have that in one part of the quilt. And over here are all the words that barrage us, reading, listening, the messages. So I put them side by side, but separated them because they're different formats. This is a story told by a deaf person. This is my first quilt that I tried to incorporate ASL into. Remember, I said to tell me a story, any story you want. So my friend decided to tell me about her quilting experiences because I was her first quilting teacher. So this shows her looking down, focused on her work, cutting out pictures and cutting out pieces of cloth. This is the first time that I had tried to sew faces, and I kept the eyes closed because I didn't have any experience with showing open eyes. The butterfly quilt that I've shown does have the eyes open of the child. It's really hard because you want to make sure that it looks realistic and that it's very expressive and the communication happens through the eyes. But on this very first one, since it was my first, I decided to make it a little easier on myself, and I had her casting her eyes downward. It starts realistic, and then it ends in a more abstract format. It starts with the person sitting and cutting out the fabric, looking downward, and then the middle plane of the quilt, which you see here, is the actual sewing and the sewing machine doing the work. And the progression ends in the foreground with the manipulation of the fabric. So in the background, of course, she's holding the fabric and cutting it. And then the sewing machine, and that's the sign for sewing machine, the finger poised over the palm. And then the end shows the fingers holding the fabric right up front. I put in the letter Q prominently displayed here. I figured right up front we'd identify this story as being about quilting. The title of this quilt is Peace. I was playing around with a lot of leftover fabric. I had a lot of fabric left that I didn't particularly care for anymore. I'd had it from previous projects, from 10 years back, but I wasn't really quite ready to throw it all away. I also had some fabric from some other projects that I had done recently and that I'd saved. I decided just to play around with the different colors. I had no pattern in mind. I just kind of threw them down haphazardly. And as I saw what was going on with the different pieces, something started to emerge. It seemed that it was a symbol for the diversity of people. So many different people, so many different personalities, attitudes, philosophies, opinions. So I thought, why doesn't the world provide peace for everyone? Why isn't it available to all? And I decided to choose the theme as peace as the overarching theme for the whole quilt. Each panel has a peace sign in it. The middle one, there's yellow, and that's sort of a symbol for Hawaii. Let me show you what's on the back of each panel. I also wanted this quilt to be different than any others that I had made, so I decided to divide the different sections and attach them with strings, rather than sewing them together in one contiguous piece. I thought it would make something different, something uniquely mine.